Presented by RomulusIT.com, offering remote support for common computer problems.
And this is interesting because of your background in Atlanta, Georgia. And obviously, I don't live in America, but as you probably be well aware, the southern states has a bit of its own reputation, both nationally and internationally. And when you started writing the book, there's the intro of it goes through your own family's rich background of Southern heritage and how you ended up changing your position on the Confederate flag. Do you want to, well, first of all, for listeners, just explain that, but also, maybe elaborate on Confederate and Southern history and its place in the American South?
Oh, I'd love to. Yes, as I explain in my introduction, to sort of give a personal touch and sort of my origin story for how I sort of became a skeptic. I am a lifelong Southerner. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. My family has been in Georgia specifically for close to 200 years. And in the South for, I think, a century more than that, at least. So our roots run pretty deep here. And so having grown up in the South, I had grown up with sort of the culture of the sort of lost cause of the Confederacy. I was sort of acculturated to think of the Civil War as the war between the states, and that the Civil War had been fought over, the issues of states' rights, that, slavery was there, but that's not what the Confederacy was really fighting for, is what we were, sort of not taught in school, but just sort of, again, acculturated to believe. Even for myself, it'd be comforting to think that. Part of my heritage here in the South is that even just directly in my family tree, I have 5 Confederate soldiers that I'm directly descended from, and that's not even getting into uncles and other kinds of ancillary members of the family. And so that's the way I came up, pretty much, at least up through high school, give or take. I went to the University of Georgia for my undergraduate education here in Athens, Georgia. And while I was there, this was around 2000, on either side of that, that was when Georgia had a major controversy going on about our state flag. The state flag of Georgia at the time, since the 1960s at least, possibly the 1950s, I think it was the 50s, for about half a century, the Georgia flag had been redesigned to incorporate the battle flag of the Confederacy. And so this sort of came to a head in the late 90s with people objecting to the fact that our state flag included symbolism from the Confederacy. And so in the early 2000s, there was a push to change this. There was some pushback. There were fraternities, for instance, in Georgia that would sometimes fly the Confederate flag or continue to fly the old Georgia flag even after it had been changed. And during all this time, one of the things I wanted to do was initially to sort of look into the Confederacy myself. And I thought, with all this debate back and forth of what the Confederacy stood for, I thought at the time what would be a good way to sort of recapture the sort of dignity of, again, the Confederate ancestors I had, which would be to sort of find these references. I thought I would set out to find references from early on in the war, finding the Confederate political leaders and possibly the military leaders, where maybe they were saying this was about states' rights, this was not about slavery. I thought I could find those, so I went looking for them in what was available on the internet at the time, and I was somewhat distressed to suddenly discover that they were saying exactly the opposite. That when you search out the statements that Confederate leaders were making right at the time the South seceded, they were abundantly clear that they were seceding about slavery. The state of Mississippi had a Declaration of Secession that said, I think in its opening sentence, that their action in seceding from the United States was fully associated with slavery. The governor of Georgia at the time wrote an open letter to the people of Georgia, who for the most part were pretty poor and not slave owners, trying to convince them that you should support secession even though you don't own slaves because slavery is still important to you. The state of Georgia sent a delegate to the Virginia Secession Convention, and while he was there, he again made it very clear this is about slavery. Over and over again, in the early days of when the states were seceding, in the early days of the war, they said repeatedly secession was about slavery. And then it was only once the war was over and they had lost, and this looked bad for history, that they all kind of started retconning and retroactively changing what that agenda had been, because that looked bad for them and bad for the South in retrospect.
And is that visible? Like, is there evidence of, doctoring of text or speeches from that time?
It's not doctoring text. It's just, for instance, Alexander Stephens was a Georgian. He was the vice president of the Confederacy, and he gave a speech. I want to say it was like March of 1861. It was shortly before the Civil War began. He gave this barn burner of a speech in Savannah, Georgia, where he said that slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederacy, and that the Confederacy was the first nation in the history of the world built upon the truth that the white man was superior. It is this cornerstone speech of Stephens is one of the most often cited passages to show that this is what the Confederacy's mission was about. After Stephens survived the war, he wrote some memoirs I want to say in the early 1870s, 1880s. And so a decade after the war, when he's suddenly writing about living through the Confederacy, in those memoirs, he paints a very different picture of it. In those memoirs, suddenly it's all about states' rights and just sort of fighting Northern oppression and that sort of thing. So it's not a matter of rewriting text. It's just a matter of, after the fact, when various Southerners are reflecting back on the war, all of their history that they were writing later just sort of ignores his cornerstone speech. It ignores those declarations of secession and just sort of concocts other rationales that they then just sort of say, this is what we were feeling at the time. And what they'll often cite to, instead of citing to, again, the cornerstone speech, they'll point to, say, a speech that the president of the Confederacy gave where he simply didn't mention slavery. And they'll point to that as like, he didn't mention slavery, therefore it wasn't about slavery. It's like it's a speech to the military. He's not really talking about what the Confederacy's mission is. The fact that he didn't mention slavery doesn't mean that it's not that. You've simply identified a speech where it didn't come up. But if that remains to this day, that speech of Jefferson Davis as the Confederacy's president, one of the most often cited bits of proof in quotes, that Confederate defenders will use.
This episode is brought to you by Romulus IT, offering fast, affordable remote support for common computer problems, including troubleshooting, health checks, virus removal, and software support. Visit RomulusIT.com to get your computer back on track.